that the number one challenge we face in the world today comes from China. To understand China, you have to understand that there are three real strong elements. There's the People's Liberation Army, there's the Chinese Communist Party, and then there's the business community. And sometimes they work together, and sometimes they're at different perspectives. So in order to understand China, we need to understand both the national security implications, but also the economic implications. For the economy, we brought in John Malden and David Tice. David's recently been in China, and John Malden has written extensively on China as an economic opportunity. From a national security perspective, we brought in Frank Gaffney, who goes into a deep dive on the national security threat that China poses. We'll cover first the economic, and then we'll cover the national security. Join me in the economic war room. So we're in the economic war room, and we're talking with John Malden and David Tice. The subject here is China. John has written 5 of his thoughts from the front line recently on the subject of China, trade wars, China innovation, and so forth. David has recently returned from China. He was looking at investments and just kind of watching the economy as it's growing. So I want to get their thoughts, and I want to go into a deep dive. Let's talk about China. John, you've written on thoughts from the front line. You've covered China innovation. In fact, the 5 that I recently looked at, China's command innovation. Tell us about that.
China, the first 2 letters I did were China bullish letters. There's a lot to be bullish on China about. I mean, where they come from in 1979 to where they are today, it's an economic miracle. They moved 300 million people to cities, taking them from the Stone Age, not the Stone Age, the medieval age, to pull them up, made middle-class citizens out of them. They're still doing that.
And they built a huge economy.
I mean, one of my readers wrote me back and says, I've just done a 2,500 mile trek through Western China, going through he called, and I love it, his quote was, little cities of only 2 million people. And it's booming. He says everywhere you go in Western China, the cranes are there because that's the one belt, that's the one road part of the one belt, one road that's they're building out and defining.
Well, they began by literally, they've stolen a lot of technology, but you write about how now they've gone from technology copiers to innovators on their
Well,
own.
and that is the real difference. There's no question, wouldn't deny it at all, they stole their way to where they are. It's not unusual for developing, frontier economies to do that.
But now they're making massive research investments, big venture capital.
They are putting as much money into venture capital as the U.S. is. I mean, that's and by the way, in an economy that is 1/4 of the GDP per person as ours, I mean, it is a truly massive. And the fascinating thing about it is it's not just the government-sponsored monies. They've now gone to Tencent and Alibaba and all these other companies that have been sheltered, that have been, okay, we're protecting the markets for you. And they've now said, okay, you're making billions and billions of dollars. Take that money and put it into venture capital. Take that money and grow it. Take that money and become innovative with it. And
you've got a chart that you showed in your letter. China's venture fundraising climbs to U.S. levels.
Yes. It is, and I don't think their venture funding will be any more successful than ours. I mean, as all of us know here, if you have a venture fund that 10 or 15% of their funds actually hit, I mean, there's a small batting average, they're really successful because the ones that hit go 100 to 1. And so I don't think theirs are going to be any better than ours, but they are really targeting artificial intelligence, they're targeting biotech, they're targeting automobile automation, and I think they're going to be every bit the equal of the U.S. in 10 years because what you target what you plan for is what you're going to reap. And in venture capital, it's a 10-year process.
You were just there, David. Did you see this, what John's writing about on paper, what I read on my computer? Did you see this in reality?
I saw, some amazing things. I went to Shenzhen, which is known as the Silicon Valley part of China. And this is a city that in 1979 was only 30,000 people, so a true fishing village. It's now 12 million people today, and there's talk that it could actually be 20 million people. I ended up seeing the KKR of China, which is a company that has developed these massive technology, office parks, and they provide venture capital to companies, and they fund companies, and then they end up giving subsidized rents to these companies, and then they provide potentially free housing for their employees, and they have a shopping mall and green space. Those companies, 300 companies, are creating $2 billion in sales.
So over 40 years, they've gone from 30,000 to 12 million. I was there in the middle of that. In 1999, I went with Mark Mobius when I worked for Templeton, and we visited Shenzhen. And I remember this is a brand new city. Everything about it is new. There's no newer city on the planet was my thinking at the time. And you said they've just grown from there.
Yes, and when people have talked about ghost cities and the largesse through, debt, in China that, frankly, I've been nervous about, I wonder if a lot of those ghost cities weren't essentially started from some of these, office parks like this, but essentially it's not just building apartments, it's built with a plan, where we're going to have companies and we're going to have R&D and we're going to, pick the smartest companies, and, that it's a way to build out and to move these 300 million people from rural to urban that John just talked about. So it's
There's
really great.
another 300 million out there that are trying to figure out how to get in. They want into the cities. Well, they're going to be moving to other cities besides Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen. And the ghost cities that we were talking about 5-10 years ago, those cities are filling up.
They're filling up.
I mean, the reality is China is doing something that no culture in the history of the world has ever done. Now, we moved 100 million people from Europe, essentially, to the U.S., or however many it was that came over and then grew up. They moved 250 million people in 30 years, 300 plus now million. That's a migration on a scale that humanity's never seen.
They're not just moving people. They're training and raising up scientists and technologists. I mean, you've got another chart, the countries with the most STEM graduates. Tell us about that.
It's like 10 times what we're doing in the U.S. And I remember 10 years ago, you'd read about that because they had that same advantage back then. And people in the U.S. would go, yeah, but that's with second and third tier universities. It's not from real universities like those in the U.S. Well, today you look at it, and they're putting out as many patents or more than we are. Those second and third tier universities that we were poo-pooing, turns out those graduates are cranking out patents, papers,
Scientific
research,
papers. You've got a chart in there that
scientific-
shows China's dominating. 25% of all scientific papers are coming from China.
It is, you've got to admire what they've done. I mean, happened in a top-down economy, it happened in a culture that, philosophically, politically, we're probably not comfortable with, but you've still got to go, wow, they did it. And the second thing that I think we have to realize is they aren't stopping. Now, that doesn't disqualify the fact that they're still not playing fair on letting U.S. countries in. They're still not playing fair on the culture barriers. They're still not, they have a desire to be geopolitically dominant, especially within the Asian sphere. They're pushing back on the U.S. all of those geopolitical concerns are real.
Let's talk about that, David. 'Cause you and I have shared reading and passion for a book titled Unrestricted Warfare, written by two senior colonels of the People's Liberation Army. Tell me, what was your perspective as an investment man who read this, who's recently been to China? What do you think they're thinking?
So I'm a little bit concerned, Kevin, about, China has been, a very, very strong culture for, society for 4,000 years, and they've been down for the last 150. And they are now, getting their mojo back. They've gotten it back, and they're now the second, biggest economy in the world. I worry a little bit, a fair amount, frankly,
I was going to say, you worry more than a little bit.
about what, their aspirations are, potentially militarily. Do they want to supplant the United States, or are they okay with, sharing the mantle with us? I understand how, frankly, there's a lot of countries that feel like the U.S. has misused their position as world's reserve currency, and we push people around, et cetera, and they want an equal seat at the table, and I completely understand that. That now the question is, how far do they want to go? Do they want to crush us, or are they going to be okay with at an equal seat at the table?
Well, in 2013, the official policy was stated as, we must de-Americanize the world. How would you interpret that?
So it could be interpreted a few different ways. I mean, I think, America did get, too full of itself in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of people, that have said we've, thrown our weight around a little bit much, and and so it's possible that is, to be, considered. Now, we're going to have to watch how that plays out. I think we have to be vigilant, in watching. We're worried, the military is worried about what's going on in the South China Sea. There were cases when, our aircraft went down. I'm not sure if it was 10 or 15 years ago, and they ended up, getting that aircraft and holding our, pilots, essentially hostage for a week and a half or so. They we'll have to see what their leadership.
At best, they're an adversary. At worst, they're an enemy. They're not an ally at this point, not militarily. No military officer in the United States believes that they are one of our firm allies. They're an adversary, and they may be an enemy.
That's certainly possible, and I do worry about that. Now, on the trade front, on the, we want to work with them, and we want to, and they are, phenomenal capitalists, as John's talked about, and innovators. Now, they've embraced, frankly, entrepreneurship and capitalism on the economic side. On the political side, they're communists. So it is bifurcated. But they have embraced the best of entrepreneurship and capitalism, and that's what's made them so strong.
What I'm concerned about, you saw the Bloomberg report that came out that said that inside the chips, the IT supply chain is compromised. Inside the chips that they manufacture, that there are chips within chips that allows Chinese access, and a lot of the things that they're producing. I don't know if you saw that recently.
It's been on everybody's computer.
Yeah.
That's disconcerting, to say the least. But I'm going to switch the topic a little bit here, going back to the last two reports when I talked about trade tariffs. And because that has the potential to upset the apple cart in ways that are very disconcerting. We saw that Trump used the threat of tariffs to bring Canada and Mexico to the table, and he got minor changes. So I would call it NAFTA 1.2, not 2.0. But they were good
there were
changes.
improvements.
They were definitely improvements.
Applauded by all sides of the political spectrum.
Well, and if you think about it for a second, if you do a trade deal today, 20 years from now, do you think it's still...
No, it's got to be tweaked.
Of course it's got to be tweaked. And he tweaked it, and that's good. Europe has come to the table, said, let's go to zero tariffs. Now, that's a country that's a continent that says, okay, we'll go to zero tariffs, but we're still going to charge you a 16, 17, 18% average VAT in addition to the, so taking the tariffs off is almost de minimis. But that's still a good goal.
But you're worried about a potential trade
I'm
war,
worried about a trade war.
full-blown trade
Okay.
war, and the recession it could cause here. What would it do in China, and what would it do to us?
The problem is that Navarro, some of the other Trump advisors, are trying to attack the trade deficit like the trade deficit is the enemy. We can't get rid of the trade deficit. The trade deficit is a function of U.S. consumers not saving enough and buying a lot of stuff. And some of it's from China. Tariffs have never, ever economically done anything for a trade deficit. Now, tariffs may be useful as policy to deal with a country that is not behaving properly.
I think of tariffs as economically similar to a labor union going on strike. Nobody wins from a strike. The union loses, the company
That's
that
a
hired
good
them
analogy.
lose. Both sides lose, but you use it only to make your point and to force concessions in other areas.
Chinese are frustrated, and so it's going to have to be solved at the top. And if Trump and Xi can come to an agreement, and what does that look like? And Trump gets his China 1.2 or 1.4. You don't have to see 100%
If
turnaround.
he could
Let's
win if he could win the intellectual property, the forced technology transfer, where they actually acted as proper citizens of the world, they acted as a developed nation and not a developing nation, and they didn't get all the special perks that come from claiming they're an emerging market, but they actually said, well, all right, we're at the table and we belong at the table, treat us that way, and they acted that way. I think he'd achieve something great.
And I think it's probably now, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about they're becoming an innovation society, they now have intellectual property they would like to protect.
Sure.
And I think it's time for quid pro quo. You want us to protect your intellectual property, you have to protect ours. And they actually have something to protect now, and you might actually see them willing to come to the market, to the trade table, willing to negotiate that. And if that happens, then the rest of the world breathes a great sigh of relief, and we take that risk off the table. There's 250, I saw a list the other day, 250 companies that are significantly impacted. Qualcomm sells 60% of its chips to China. I mean, there's just this whole list of companies that are sell more than 40 or 50% of their products to China that would just fall out of bed.
Putting aside the risks of unrestricted warfare that you and I have talked about, David, and I think they're real and serious, putting that aside, we're still in a technology race. John points out that they're advancing innovation quite rapidly. We're in a technology race over 5G. We're in a technology race over artificial intelligence, over quantum computing. And the winner of those areas will dominate. Do you have any, when you were meeting with people in China, did you see any of the development there?
So we were lucky enough to see, to tour the Hans Robots, which is a major, multi-billion-dollar company in Shenzhen, and they have increased their growth dramatically. They're expected to increase their growth 8-fold over the next 10 years. And, just some phenomenal technology. And, I mentioned the office park, that is the KKR version in China. So what I think China has done is embrace the best parts of our entrepreneurial ideas and incentive systems, etc. So for for a communist political system, they've understood what capitalism is about, on the economic side, and my hat's off to them in that.
So if we get a situation with China where we get past the unrestricted warfare, trade warfare, intellectual property theft, we're still in a massive horse race against a very capable adversary.
I think U.S. companies are in a horse race with Chinese companies. That's mano a mano. And if the U.S. companies can't compete. Well, that's their fault. That's our fault. I am actually optimistic that U.S. companies can do very well. Thank you very much.
I'm very concerned that the Tiger's, to use the phrase, not going to be able to change its stripes. I'm concerned that the Belt and Road Initiative is pro-China, anti-America. I'm concerned that,
Oh, no question.
that the Chinese, that they want to dominate in such a powerful way, and that I don't know that we will get past. But,
Well,
but if we could get past
let-
and we're all global actors, then I would agree.
Okay, let's understand something. China is a mercantilist, not unlike Trump's policies, or to some extent mercantilist, but they are definitely imperialist. I mean, the old communist saying used to be that the U.S. was an imperialist war dog. China is imperialist in the classic sense of the term. One belt, one road is imperialism. What we need to do is to produce the high value added. We need to be continually moving up the food chain to getting the most profitable things done in the U.S. We're actually seeing jobs come back, but they're coming back to robots. And the jobs that are in the factories are high-paying jobs because they're STEM jobs, they're engineering jobs.
Larry Summers said the American hegemony ended. He wrote an op-ed pretty much with the Asia Development Bank when the Chinese said, look, we're no longer dependent on the Western financial system, we'll build our own. So they built an alternative to SWIFT, they call it CHIPS, they built an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. At the same time, they've asked and demanded their seat at the table in all of those institutions, but they've created alternatives. So if China becomes a good global player, if they become Denmark or Sweden or the United States and they're a good global player, then we've got a bright global future. I'm concerned about the other side. What do you think, David?
I want to be optimistic, frankly. So as a long-term, bear, it might be stupefying for some to consider that. But I'm very concerned. So I think we have to be vigilant, and as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify.
But at the same time, let me just say that, where are you headed to next Sunday?
I'm going to Hong Kong.
You're going back to
And
China.
Shenzhen.
And
Yeah.
Shenzhen. So you're going back.
Mhm.
So
We can't put our head in the sand
we
and say
can't put
China doesn't exist.
No.
We need to work for an optimal outcome, and the optimal outcome is not the destruction of China. The optimal outcome is to bring China to the world's table as a fair
cooperate.
participant.
But there's growth in India. There's excitement in Australia. It's everywhere if you look for it.
I mean, I'd like nothing better than there to be kumbaya. We all get along. We can all make money together. And let's hope their leaders see the same thing. I mean, I think the people, want to do business with Americans. They have no ill will towards us. They love Americans. They, wonder about Donald Trump sometimes, like we all do. But they're happy people. And so
I think if we could get, all right, so they've adopted the Adam Smith, the free market aspect of this, and China's done quite well with that. I wish we could get them to adopt the founding principles of the United States, the liberty principles that we have. But then again, I wish we could get our politicians to adopt the founding principles and move back to the liberty that's provided, individual liberties and so forth, of the Constitution. But the point is, people are people, and if they have the right system, they can prosper. And we need to find a way to make it to where we can prosper too. So I think that's great. Well, thank you to China from the perspective of investors and economists and people who've been there and studied it for a long time. There's a lot of risks associated with China, but there are great opportunities that are created in China as well. It's something that every investor in America needs to be prepared to address. And again, you need to talk to your investment advisor. Get with them and say, this is what's going on in China. How does this fit in my portfolio? What can I do? And then we need to wake up the American political spectrum to say, there are risks here. There are things that we need to address. Are tariffs the right approach or not? We just had the opportunity to speak with John Malden and David Tice about the opportunities that China might afford us. There's some risk there economically, and there's some trepidation by investors looking at China. After all, it is a communist government that's adopted some free market principles. But I want you to hear beyond that. We had Frank Gaffney in our studio, and we want to talk with him about the military risks that China may pose, some of the spying they're doing, and so forth. Is China a friend or a foe? Frank, welcome back.
It's great to be with you, Kevin. Thank you. Well, it's not even a close call. It is an avowed enemy of the United States of America. You know, one of the interesting things, and I may have learned this from you as a matter of fact, but back in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, thanks to my old boss, Ronald Reagan, the Chinese, under Deng Xiaoping, looked at the situation and realized that there was going to be a new Cold War between the United States and China. And unlike Russia, the Chinese were going to win it. And they set about, even as Deng Xiaoping was going through the openings and the reforms and trying to get American and other Western business in technology and the like, very assiduously pursuing the transformation of his country from a backwards third world nation into one that would be not just a peer competitor with the United States, but would supplant it. And as you know, in fact, I think it's on the desk here, is a well-worn copy of a plan for doing that. That, again, you've done as much as anybody to call to our attention. The master's thesis, I think it was, of two People's Liberation Army colonels published by the Chinese government in 1999 called Unrestricted Warfare. Now, there's a clue there.
Yeah.
An adversary engaged in warfare, unrestricted at that, against our country, a lot of it in the battle space that you cover so well, the economic zone.
But during the 1990s, they were appearing as we're a small country, we need special treatment, we need most favored nation, and yet
At the World Trade Organization.
they started at that point infiltrating politically. I mean, we have all kinds of tie-ins with the Clintons and Charlie Tree. There was actual government, Chinese government money that came into the Clinton campaign. The Senate found it. They had to send it back. A huge scandal. That was collusion between Bill Clinton and the Chinese government, and they got caught.
But you mentioned the military. One of the things that went with those cash transfers to the Clintons, does this sound familiar? And we watched Hillary do pretty much the same thing, didn't we? But back in the day when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, one of the quid pro quos that he struck was to give the communist Chinese what amounted to the technology they needed to put multiple reentry systems and otherwise fix some of the defects they had with their ballistic missile programs, including the ballistic missiles that they were going to be aiming at us. I think this is treachery of the first order, if not out and outright treason on the part of the Clintons, but it was just another indicator, Kevin, of what the Chinese were up to, which was buy time, build up their economic power, subvert our country by stealing our technology, by basically capturing markets through predatory, transactions, trade practices, and all along to be relentlessly acquiring the technologies and training the personnel, many in our universities, that they would need to have a world-class military capable of defeating ours, or better yet, as Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese strategist, used to say, defeating us without even having to fight. That's what we're up against, and anybody who tells you, well, they're just global competitors in the marketplace, but the peaceful rise of China is still underway, is either deluding themselves or they're lying to you.
They're complicit. So here's the problem. 10 years ago, when we started working on these issues together, we'd go and we'd meet with congressmen. I met in the Pentagon multiple times. The generals and the admirals would see China as not much of a threat 10 years ago. Now they're beginning to see that China is a serious military threat. I remember, well, they don't have a blue water navy, they'll never threaten us. That's no longer what the military recognizes. We've been to some conferences, asymmetric warfare conferences, where they say, no, China is a serious adversary. On the economic side, it used to be they're a great partner, it's a great market. They're going to open up to us and they're going to give us the chance to sell to all the Chinese. That's not happened. Instead, they've literally stolen or forced technology transfers. And now they've got this new initiative to where they're supplanting American hegemony called the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you describe that?
Sure. The Belt and Road Initiative is basically a colonial infrastructure enterprise, which they are seeking to get the countries most immediately involved to pay for. It's called a debt trap. I think of it as kind of a payday loan scheme. They get them to pay for port modernization or for building a railroad or for building airfields or what have you on terms that they can't possibly pay back those loans. And then the Chinese close on them, and then they own the airfields and the ports and the trains and so on, having made these loans that were simply unsustainable. But the point is, Kevin, at every step of the way, those infrastructure developments, and by the way, at least as important, as we've talked about many times in the past, is the digital infrastructure that the Chinese are putting into place as well, alongside these physical ones, because those will enable them to control communications and information and, fundamentally the economies of these countries as they are becoming more and more and more impoverished and vassal states of the great Chinese Middle Kingdom, the empire that they haven't had for a few centuries, but they're interested in reconstituting. And at the end of the day, they know that the one real impediment to China's dream being fulfilled, as Xi Jinping, the president, says, is the United States of America.
Yeah.
And as a result, they are working hard at supplanting us. They're building institutions as well as these kinds of infrastructures designed to de-dollarize the world's economy,
Yeah,
as you've taught me.
de-Americanize the world.
These are enemies of the first order. We underestimate them and their determination, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but in the very near future, I'm afraid, to supplant America without firing a shot if they can, but probably using violence if they feel they need to.
Well, it's interesting. Part of what they're doing is they're using our capital against us. And I remember you invited me to the press club, and when Alibaba was the largest initial public offering in history, and from an economic standpoint was a bad deal, because you buy shares in Alibaba, you get a Cayman Islands corporation, you have no share ownership rights, no shareholder rights whatsoever.
No
and
transparency.
No
as to what's going
transparency.
on.
But they took $25 billion and they've been investing that, buying other American assets that now have gone away from being our treasure to being Chinese treasure.
Yeah, you mentioned the asymmetric threat symposiums that we've been at in Washington. I was at one yesterday, and I mentioned that, there seems to be a Chinese modification to the quote, I think it's apocryphal, but it certainly was trenchant, attributed to Vladimir Lenin, that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. Well, the Chinese fillip to that is the Americans, the capitalists in the West, will finance the purchase of the rope with which we will hang them. And a case in point, as we've talked about, Kevin, is apparently on the Frankfurt International Capital Market, the Chinese have sold dollar-denominated bonds to pay for the aircraft carrier that they will ultimately be using as part of this military threat to the United States of America. And that's just one example, and I'm afraid that probably their whole Blue Water Navy and a lot of other things besides, just to give other calibration points on the commitment the Chinese are making to their military, including the part that very directly threatens us, is they've built 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels in which to hide the nuclear missiles that they are aiming at us. and make them essentially invulnerable to any kind of protection from us.
3,000 miles underground
Think
of
about it.
tunnels.
That's
to-
roughly the width of the continental United States.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
The most immense public works project, I guess, since the Great Wall of China. In fact, they call it the underground Great Wall of China. Only this one has nuclear warheads on it, and with Bill Clinton's technology transfer, those are pointed very dangerously at us.
And they've financed it through our purchase of Chinese goods, that they've been doing bad trade practices and so forth. And then they've been adding these, the Bloomberg report on the chips, where there was hidden inside the chip a second chip. So when our military buys technology, they're buying Chinese tainted technology. Our IT supply chain is tainted, and the Chinese have a role and control. It's very scary. And this is not, China is not our friend. And it's not a free and open society. In fact, the President Xi has banned Winnie the Pooh because he doesn't like the comparison to how he looks with. It's not a free society. Can you imagine if President Trump banned any cartoon of him? This is a very closed society. They're persecuting Christians to a great degree, tearing down churches. They're persecuting Muslims to a great degree. It is not a free society, although they've adopted capitalist principles and they've taken advantage of our economy and our openness to finance all of this treachery. So China is not our friend. China is an adversary at best and maybe a direct enemy. And so when you consider your investments, don't look at the shiny opportunity in China. Look beyond at the national security implications. And one of the things we see, you need to weaponize your money so that when you make investments, when you make commitments, they are for the benefit of your family as well as your future. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.